You call that a spin? My grandmother could hold a rifle steadier than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. The drill sergeant's voice cracked like a whip across the humid air of the parade ground, followed immediately by the sickening, hollow clatter of an M1 Garand rifle hitting the asphalt. The crowd of civilians gathered for the base's annual open day winced collectively. It was a sound that made every military heart sink, the sound of failure, of disrespect to the weapon, and of public humiliation. In the front row, leaning heavily on a cane that looked as weathered as his face, an old man named Henry closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. It wasn't a gesture of judgment, but one of pained sympathy. He knew the weight of that wood and steel, and he knew the stinging shame burning the cheeks of the young recruit who had just dropped it. But the drill sergeant, a man named Vance who wore his authority like a bludgeon, saw the movement differently. If you believe that true strength is often hidden in the most unassuming places and that respect must always be earned, please take a moment to like this video and comment "honor" below to show your support for those who have served. The atmosphere at the Fort Benning Open Day was supposed to be festive, a celebration of precision and discipline designed to wow the families and impress the local community. The sun was beating down on the fresh asphalt, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the horizon, but the platoon of young recruits standing at attention didn't dare flinch. They were attempting the Queen Anne spin, a notoriously difficult ceremonial maneuver that required spinning the 10-pound rifle 360 degrees in the air and catching it perfectly at the balance point without looking. It was a move that separated the soldiers from the guards, a test of nerves as much as dexterity. But today, the nerves were shattering. 3 recruits had already fumbled, their sweaty palms slipping against the polished wood stocks. Private Miller, the youngest of the bunch with terror written plainly in his wide eyes, had just sent his weapon clattering to the ground for the second time. Sergeant Vance, whose veins were bulging from his neck, seemed to take the failures as a personal insult. He paced the line, his boots crunching on the gravel, looking for a target for his frustration. Someone to blame for the embarrassment of his squad performing poorly in front of the civilians. That was when his eyes locked onto Henry. The old man was standing just behind the velvet rope barrier, wearing a faded grey windbreaker that was far too warm for the weather and a flat cap that cast a shadow over his eyes. He looked frail, his posture slightly stooped, his knuckles white as they gripped the handle of his cane. When Miller dropped the rifle, Henry had let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh and shaken his head. To Vance, fueled by adrenaline and irritation, it looked like mockery. The sergeant stopped pacing. The silence on the parade ground was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of wind in the flags. Vance turned his entire body toward the crowd, pointing a gloved finger directly at Henry. "You got something to say, Pops?" Vance shouted, his voice projecting clearly to the hundreds of spectators. "I saw you shaking your head. You think this is easy? You think these recruits are just playing games?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Mothers pulled their children closer. Henry blinked, looking up with watery, calm eyes. He didn't speak, just offered a small, apologetic shrug, trying to make himself smaller. But Vance wasn't letting it go. He needed to reassert dominance, to show the crowd that the failure wasn't his teaching, but the difficulty of the task. "No, don't look away now," Vance sneered, walking closer to the barrier. "It's easy to judge from the cheap seats, isn't it? It's easy to stand there with your cane and shake your head at men who are actually in the arena." The young recruits, still frozen at attention, looked mortified. Private Miller looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Henry cleared his throat, his voice rasping slightly from disuse. "No disrespect intended, Sergeant," Henry said softly. It's all in the wrist. The boy is fighting the weight. He needs to let the rifle do the work." Vance laughed, a harsh barking sound that lacked any humor. "Oh, we have an expert," he announced to the crowd, throwing his arms wide. We have a tactical genius in the front row. He says it's all in the wrist. Vance unclipped the rope barrier and gestured to the open asphalt. Well, since you know the technique so well, why don't you come show Private Miller how it's done? Come on. Put your money where your mouth is, old-timer. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the audience. This felt cruel. Henry looked to be in his late 70s, maybe older. His hands trembled slightly with what looked like Parkinson's or just the ravages of age. I'm retired, son, Henry said quietly, his pride preventing him from pleading but his tone firm. I haven't held a peace in a long time. I insist, Vance pressed, his smile predatory. Unless, of course, you're just a loudmouth civilian who doesn't know the first thing about discipline. That word, discipline, seemed to strike a chord in Henry. His jaw tightened. The trembling in his hand seemed to still for a microsecond. He looked at the sergeant, then at the terrified face of Private Miller, who was holding his rifle like a foreign object. Henry slowly hooked his cane over the barrier. He straightened his back, a painful, clicking adjustment that added 2 inches to his height. The crowd went deadly silent as the old man stepped onto the parade ground. He walked with a limp, favoring his right leg, his worn loafers scuffing against the pristine surface. As Henry approached the formation, the contrast was stark. The recruits were in crisp, pressed dress blues, young and fit. Henry was in baggy civilian clothes, looking like a strong wind might knock him over. Vance smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. Go ahead, Miller, Vance ordered. Give the man your weapon. Let's see the master at work. Don't break a hip, Pops. Miller hesitated, then extended the M1 Garand toward Henry. The old man reached out. He didn't take it with 2 hands. He reached out with his left hand, his non-dominant hand, most would assume, and grasped the rifle at the balance point. As soon as his skin touched the wood, something transformed. It was subtle at first. The hunch in his shoulders vanished. His chin lifted. The way he held the 10-pound weapon wasn't the grip of a frail senior. It was an extension of his arm. He hefted it once, feeling the weight, his eyes narrowing as he checked the sights without even bringing it to his shoulder. For a fleeting moment, the years seemed to melt away from his face, replaced by a mask of absolute, icy concentration. The Queen Anne, Henry muttered, more to himself than anyone else. You're gripping too tight, son. He looked at Miller, ignoring Vance entirely. It's a dance. You don't drag your partner, you guide her. Vance rolled his eyes. Less talking, more spinning. Let's see it. Henry took a breath. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart. He dropped his right hand to his side, leaving the heavy rifle held solely in his left. The crowd held its breath, expecting him to drop it, or worse, injure himself. Then, with a snap of his wrist that was so fast it was almost invisible, Henry launched the rifle into the air. It didn't just spin, it hummed. The weapon became a blur of wood and steel, rotating on a perfectly vertical axis. It wasn't a standard spin, it was a triple rotation, high into the air, far higher than the recruits had dared. The rifle reached its apex, glistening in the sun, and began to fall. Henry didn't move his feet. He didn't look up with panic. He simply waited. Smack. The sound was crisp, sharp, and authoritative. Henry's left hand had snatched the rifle out of the air at the exact moment it returned to the balance point. He didn't flinch. The weapon was perfectly perpendicular to the ground, frozen in space as if it were a statue. He hadn't used his right hand at all. He had executed the notorious suicide spin variant of the Queen Anne, a move banned in basic training for its danger, one-handed, with a nonchalance that was terrifying. The silence that followed was absolute. It was shattered a second later, not by applause, but by the sound of boots running. A high-ranking officer, General Reynolds, who had been watching from the VIP tent, was striding onto the field, his face pale. Sergeant Vance was staring at Henry with his mouth slightly open, the arrogance drained completely from his face. He recognized that spin. He had seen it in black and white training films from the 1970s. "Attention!" General Reynolds barked, his voice booming without a microphone. The recruits snapped to, and even Vance straightened up instinctively. The general stopped 3 feet from Henry and rendered a slow, deeply respectful salute. Henry shifted the rifle to a port-arms position and returned the salute with a sharpness that belonged to a man half his age. "I thought I recognized that profile," the general said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sergeant Major Henry Sterling, the Golden Left. You're the man who wrote the Ceremonial Guard Manual in 1974. The crowd gasped. The whispers started immediately. Henry Sterling was a legend, the only man to ever lead the silent drill platoon for 10 consecutive years. Famous for his ability to drill flawlessly despite a combat injury that had limited the use of his right arm, hence the one-handed left-side spins. He wasn't just an old man. He was the architect of the very discipline Vance was trying to teach. Vance looked like he wanted to vanish. He had just mocked a living legend, a man whose boots he wasn't fit to shine. Henry lowered his salute and turned to the general, then to Vance. There was no malice in Henry's eyes, only a tired patience. He turned back to Private Miller and handed the rifle back, handle first. "You have good hands, Private," Henry said gently, his voice carrying in the silent parade ground. "But you're letting fear dictate your movement. Respect the weapon, but don't fear it. And never," he paused, glancing sideways at Sergeant Vance, "never mistake silence for weakness." Henry tipped his flat cap to the general, picked up his cane from the barrier, and began to limp away. The applause started slowly, then erupted into a thunderous roar. People were cheering, whistling, and clapping. The recruits were watching him leave with wide, reverent eyes. Vance took a step forward, swallowing his pride. "Sergeant Major," he called out. Henry paused. Vance saluted, holding it until Henry acknowledged him with a nod. It was a lesson in humility that none of them, especially Vance, would ever forget. True mastery doesn't need to shout, it speaks for itself.